In this chapter, we're going to be talking about watercolour mediums, which ones live in the family of watercolour, their characteristics, and what we can do with them. And today I'm going to be just running through and demonstrating with you the kinds of things that you can try at home with each of these watercolour mediums. So we're here to talk about watercolours today, and in front of me is the basic watercolour family. Tubes of watercolour, watercolour pan, inks and gouache. I'm going to run through with you the ones that I like to use the most, and we're going to start here with the watercolour pan. This is brilliant for when you're first starting out. This is a 24. It comes in 12s or 8s. And I would probably just start with an 8 colour. It's great because you can experiment with a whole variety of colour. When you first get your pan set, you want to just test the colours that are in them. And this is just a little size 8 brush. A smaller brush is good because they are quite dinky. So as you can see, I have already tested all these colours. And what I do, I put down my field of water, just a little rectangle of water, and then I dip in, give it a good smush around, and then we just fill that top part, and you can already see how it spreads through the water. The reason I like to do that is because each colour, each pigment colour, moves through the water at different rates, and that's something that you'll learn over time. Some of them kind of just dawdle their way through and others shoot through the water. And I like to see what happens when I just pull some of that colour down as well, so it's like the half tone of that colour. So that's our permanent sap green. I'm going to do the same here for olive green. Just dabbing in a little square of water. And you want to make sure you wash out your brush in between each colour test. Make sure it's nice and clean so you get a true read of the colour that you're testing. There we go. Oh, I love olive green. I use this a lot. And you can see how that's sort of spreading there through the water. The reason I put the water down first is because the point really for me of watercolour paints is that lovely spread that you get where it shoots through the water, because the water is your vehicle, and that is what makes them super special, right? Makes them different from any other paint that you're going to use is the amount of water. It just changes everything from the tone of your colour to the experimental marks that you get. It's all about the water. So I think doing a test with the thing that you're going to be using the most is like super important for you. This is a brilliant beginner set, and I would highly recommend that that's where you start. And we're going to move on to our tubes of watercolour. What I'm going to show you today is all the different consistencies that you can get with just one colour of watercolour paint. And the reason that's important is because each of these watercolour pigments have a lot of bandwidth. So first of all, I'm just going to start with a big blob. Tip that in just a little bit less, little bit less. So I'm using an ultramarine blue here, which is one of my faves. I'm using a ceramic mixing dish, and I just happen to really like the weight of it because it doesn't rock about too much. This is a little pipette, and it just sucks up water. I'm going to add water into each of these. I'm not going to add it to the first one. And I'm going to add more as we move around this circle. And what we're going to get is just different consistencies of the pigment. So I've wet my brush, and I'm going to just show you what this is like without any water in it. And this is not how I use watercolour ever, because it needs to have its mate, water, in my opinion. But just to show you the thickness of it, it's very dense. And my brush is a little bit wet, but if it weren't, it would just be very draggy. It would just sort of do something more like that. Now, next up, we've got one with just a little bit more water in it. So your colour is still quite saturated. I'd say it's the sort of consistency of, let's say, double cream. There we go. That's just painting it straight on. And in the next one, I'm going to wash that out. Even more water. So this is maybe the consistency of milk now, or maybe skim milk. See how we're getting much lighter. Lovely and washy. And as we move around the circle, you can guess what's going to happen. It's just going to get lighter and lighter until what we end up with is almost the consistency of our friend ink. So a water-soluble ink will look something like this. So let's go to the very last one, which is barely any pigment in that at all. And it's just the lightest, lightest tone. So you can see how much you can do with each colour just by adding water. This is a great way to start out, just to get used to how the paint and water merge together and work together so that you're sort of understanding the consistencies when you start to paint. So second in our family of watercolours are inks, and there are two types of inks. There are permanent dye inks, which become waterproof once they've dried. And then there's our water-soluble inks. You can layer up the water-soluble inks and they will act like other watercolours do. You can lift some of them off the paper, you can reactivate them with water, and with the permanent inks, they're just going to stay as they are, and it's kind of a little bit harder to layer them up. Not impossible, but definitely a little bit trickier. So you just have to bear that in mind, and they can both be used to great advantage separately or together. First of all, what we're going to do is just lay down a little field of water here to show the reaction that we get when we drop in the water-soluble ink, and then next to it we're going to do an example of the waterproof ink or the permanent ink. Now I use both of them when I'm painting, and they both have, as I say, they both have their own benefits and their own characteristics, and you just get to know them over time. So I've just dropped in enough water. I want to get it quite wet because we really want to see how that ink flows through the water. And these moments are why I love this medium. It's the surprise element. Just drop it in the corner. Now each pigment or colour moves at a different rate. Depending on how much water you have down will determine how fast or what direction they move to. So there's all these different variants, and I think that can be a little bit intimidating sometimes, but once you embrace the magic of them, you can just create such incredible things. Check this out. See how that one spreads through. Isn't that amazing? All right, now, so that's some of the movement we're getting with different colours, and they've sort of all done different things. The right-hand side, we're going to just do the same thing. Got my filbert brush here. I like him because it really sucks up a lot of water, so it's great for doing large areas of water like this. And let's see if we've got a similar colour over here. Give them a really good shake, because sometimes those pigments get sort of stuck at the bottom. So you want to give them a really good shake. There we go, that one's spreading. And we will do a nice bluey kind of colour here. Let's do a different shape, see what happens. Let's just add in white as well and see what happens. And you can control inks as well. I'm showing you sort of their rawest form right now, but they have so many great characteristics. So it's great just to experiment with lots of water and dropping things on. And so that's our inks. Third in our family of watercolor mediums is gouache. And this is a little bit different because it's highly pigmented and a little bit thicker than the other two mediums that we've looked at. So I'm going to show you in a similar way to the watercolors just what happens when we add in more water to our gouache and what that sort of sweet spot is, you know, for painting with it. Well, first of all, let's just use it straight out the tube. It's quite dry, but it's still quite malleable. Can still create a lovely, solid kind of tone across the paper. With watercolors as a comparison, we often get things like little watermarks and rings and different, more textural kind of moments. But with the gouache, you can get a lovely flat finish. This is, again, kind of like that sort of double cream consistency. I like it just a little bit thicker generally, but you want it to just flow from your brush. That's the sort of sweet point, I think, with gouache. So there we go. As you can see, it's not giving me any of that sort of pooling action, and as it dries, it will dry a consistent flat colour. So when I say flat, what I mean is a sort of consistent coverage of the colour that you're using. It doesn't have as many textures running through it. It doesn't have like marks and pooling that you sometimes get with watercolour. It gives you a sort of clean layer. The reason that I don't put water down first for gouache is because we're not looking to see any kind of spread from it, because that's not what it does. That's not its characteristic. It's more of a solid, sturdy, consistent medium to use. So you're really not going to see any of the wondrous things that like ink's properties have or watercolor has. So there we go, that's the palest with the most water, just like a light wash of it. When I paint with gouache, I typically end in this kind of area, and maybe with some areas that are a little bit thicker, because again, I reserve the sort of washy, ethereal moments for watercolor or for inks, because they just, that's what they do. They don't have to try hard, you know, they just do that for me. And don't forget, you know, it's fine to mix all of these mediums together. You don't have to be a purist. You can play with them all. You can see which layer works best, you know. Oh, it didn't work when I put down the gouache first and then I tried to put watercolor on top. Didn't know that was going to happen, but you have to just try and see. That's the fun part, right? That's the process part. That's the bit we all love. So I'm just going to show you a very quick demo using just 2 colours and my sponge brush, just to kind of give you an idea of how I might use ink in my day-to-day and just creating a little flower. So I'm dipping in to my clean water, but you could use dirty water if you wanted. And I'm just going to lay down. And the reason I'm kind of ducking and diving right now is because I'm just using plain water on my paper. Sometimes it's kind of hard to see the boundaries of that and where you've laid it down. But if you look to the side, you will be able to see where your water is. And I've got lots of water because I really want the ink to spread through it. So again, I'm really loading up my sponge brush. I've basically put down a rough shape of a flower. Now, it might be a little bit hard for you to see right now, but all will be revealed as I drop in ink. Ready? I still get excited every time. So the key to this and painting in general is to just have a go. Don't get caught up in something looking perfect, because I don't know what this ink is going to do. I don't know. It's got a life of its own. And I think it's just like, if you can embrace that and then just work with it. Like, sometimes I'll put some ink on the paper and it won't do what I wanted it to or what I thought it might do. And then I just work with what it's given me. You know, it's all about adapting and just having fun with it. So maybe I'll add in a little bit of red now, just to show. And it's I really put on a lot of water here. So you can see it's really pooling in some areas. And what you might want to do is take a little bit of your paper towel and just see what happens when you suck up some of that water and ink and see how it moves. So right there, I've got the beginnings of a beautiful, ethereal poppy print. And all I've used is my ink dropper. And I'm going to just drop into the dry areas now, and that will react differently because there's no water on the paper. So the marks that you get will be much cleaner, and you can play around with that. Maybe you end up putting a little bit of your ink in your palette and use a paintbrush, and you add those marks on as well. And see what happens there. Give it a bit of a center. And as that ink and the water dry, if you continue to add, it's going to act differently again because it's not as wet as it was 5 minutes ago. So there are so many different layers and things that can happen when you work with ink. And that really is the thing to embrace and enjoy. I'll call it a day there. Cute little fella. So we've looked at all the different mediums in watercolor that you can purchase, but it's always a bit tricky, isn't it, to know where to start. I would always recommend, to begin with, just buy one of these predetermined color pans and practice with the colors that you have in there. So when I first started painting, I didn't really have an end subject in mind. You know, it was really playing with each of these mediums. That's how I began, was just making little marks on paper. So you don't have to have the pressure of a finished painting. Just fill up a wonderful sheet. I mean, I'd like that on my wall. I just like seeing, you know, all these little marks are so wonderful in their own right. There's a whole world of watercolor paints out there for you to explore. And the very best way that you can do that is by putting paint to paper.